Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the perfumed parlors of Victorian England, where you're clutching a delicate silk fan that holds more power than a loaded pistol. You can feel the weight of ivory and lace in your gloved hands as gaslight flickers across the wallpaper, casting dancing shadows that seem to whisper secrets. The air is thick with the scent of rose water and the tension of unspoken desires, because in this world, a simple flutter of painted silk can destroy a marriage, start a romance, or ruin a reputation forever. You're surrounded by ladies in elaborate bustles and gentlemen in tailcoats, all playing an intricate game where one wrong gesture could see you banished from polite society. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in this social minefield without accidentally proposing to your own cousin or challenging someone's father to a duel. The stakes are impossibly high, the rules are invisible, and everyone is watching everyone else for the slightest misstep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little global community of insomniacs and history lovers gathering together. You find yourself in 1870s London, seated in the drawing room of Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, a woman whose reputation for discretion is matched only by her legendary collection of fans. The wallpaper depicts peacocks in impossible shades of emerald and gold, and everywhere you look, fans are displayed like works of art, some mounted in glass cases, others artfully arranged on marble-topped tables. Mrs. Pemberton herself sits across from you, her steel-gray hair perfectly coiffed beneath a lace cap, her fingers dancing across the ribs of an exquisite fan painted with cherry blossoms. "My dear," she says, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who learned to speak by imitating the Queen herself. "You must understand that what I'm about to teach you is not mere decoration. These fans are instruments of power, weapons of influence, and libraries of meaning that have been passed down through generations of clever women." You watch as she demonstrates the most basic position, fan held against the right cheek, and explains that this simple gesture means yes. Hold it against the left cheek, and you've just said no without uttering a word. It seems almost absurdly simple until she begins to show you the subtle variations, the angle of the wrist, the speed of the movement, the number of times the fan touches the face. Each detail carries its own significance, creating a vocabulary so complex that scholars today are still debating certain interpretations. The Victorian obsession with coded communication didn't emerge in a vacuum. You're living in an era where propriety rules every interaction, where a woman speaking directly to a man she hasn't been formally introduced to could cause a scandal, and where the slightest breach of etiquette could ruin not just your own prospects, but those of your entire family. In this suffocating atmosphere of rigid social rules, fans became the secret language that allowed women to communicate everything they couldn't say aloud. Historians still argue whether fan language originated in Spain during the 16th century, or developed independently in various European courts. But by the time it reached Victorian England, it had evolved into something resembling a sophisticated telegraph system. Every respectable lady owned multiple fans, each suited to different occasions and different types of messages. Your morning fan, made of black silk and jet beads, carried its own specialized vocabulary. Your evening fan, adorned with ostrich feathers and mother-of-pearl, spoke in entirely different terms. Mrs. Pemberton opens her fan with a sharp snap, a sound that makes you flinch, and explains that this gesture alone can mean "I wish to speak to you" when done quickly, or "I am annoyed" when executed with deliberate slowness. She closes it with equal precision. the ivory ribs clicking together like bones, and informs you that this means I wish to speak to you privately. Already you're beginning to understand that you've entered a world where silence is never truly silent, where every gesture carries weight, and where the flutter of painted silk can change the course of a life. The fan in your own hands feels different now, not just an accessory, but a tool that connects you to countless women who use these same signals to navigate the treacherous waters of Victorian society, to claim agency in a world that sought to silence them, and to speak the unspeakable through the poetry of movement and position. You lean forward as Mrs. Pemberton begins demonstrating what she calls the fundamental alphabet of feminine discourse. Her fan moves through the air like a conductor's baton, each position precise and deliberate. You're about to discover that Victorian ladies didn't just wave fans around prettily. They constructed entire conversations using a grammar system that would make a linguistics professor weep with admiration. Place the fan against your lips, she instructs, and you watch as she demonstrates the gesture with theatrical precision. This means silence or be quiet. But notice, she shifts the fan slightly lower so it rests against her chin. This means I wish to become acquainted with you. 1 inch of difference, my dear, between telling someone to hush and inviting them into your social circle. The complexity is staggering. You observe as she fans herself slowly, explaining that this signals I am married, while rapid fanning declares I am engaged. Drawing the fan across the forehead means we are being watched, a signal that could save reputations and prevent scandals in drawing rooms where chaperones lurked behind every potted palm. You begin to realize that every Victorian gathering was essentially a silent theater, where dozens of conversations were happening simultaneously through choreographed fan movements. Mrs. Pemberton demonstrates the resting the fan on the right ear position, which means you have changed. It's a deliciously passive-aggressive way to inform someone that you've noticed their altered behavior without actually confronting them directly. Meanwhile, touching the fan to your right cheek means yes, but pressing it firmly against your heart declares you have won my love, a distinction that could mean the difference between polite acknowledgement and a marriage proposal. The art of fan twirling particularly fascinates you. Mrs. Pemberton spins her fan in her right hand while explaining that this means I wish to get rid of you. Imagine being dismissed so elegantly that the target might not even realize they've been insulted. Twirl it in your left hand, however, and you're saying, I wish to become acquainted. The Victorians had turned rudeness into a ballet. You watch as she demonstrates carrying a fan in the right hand in front of the face, which means follow me, contrasted with carrying it in the left hand, which signals I wish to become acquainted. The subtle differences require the kind of attention to detail that would challenge a Swiss watchmaker. 1 misplaced finger, 1 incorrectly angled wrist, and you've accidentally agreed to an elopement when you meant to ask for directions to the ladies' retiring room. Historians still argue whether these signals were standardized across different regions or if families developed their own variations, but evidence suggests that the basic vocabulary was surprisingly consistent throughout England and much of Europe. Fan manufacturers even published small guides, disguised as fashion pamphlets, that taught proper usage alongside care instructions for the delicate accessories. The opening and closing of fans created an entirely separate category of communication. A fan opened wide meant, wait for me, while opening it halfway suggested friendship. Snapping it shut could signal anger, dismissal, or urgency, depending on the force and speed of the gesture. Mrs. Pemberton demonstrates each variation with the precision of a master craftsman, and you begin to understand why young ladies spent months perfecting these movements. Perhaps most intriguingly, the speed of fan movement created a temporal dimension to the language. Quick, nervous movements could signal distress or excitement, while slow, deliberate gestures conveyed calm confidence or, alternatively, barely contained fury. You're learning that Victorian ladies possessed emotional range that would shame modern method actors, all expressed through the manipulation of painted silk and ivory. The positioning of the fan when closed created yet another vocabulary layer. Resting against the right shoulder meant, "meet me tonight," while against the left shoulder suggested, "I hate you." A rather dramatic difference that explains why fan etiquette masters were in such high demand. Drawing the handle across the cheek meant, "I love you," but doing so across the eyes declared, "I am sorry." Mrs. Pemberton pauses to fan herself delicately, and you realize she's just told you, in perfect fan language, that she's married, content with the lesson's progress, and wishes to continue. The woman hasn't stopped communicating for a single moment, conducting an entire secondary conversation through gestures while speaking aloud. You're beginning to understand that fluent fan speakers essentially lived bilingual lives, constantly translating between verbal and gestural languages with the skill of diplomatic interpreters. You find yourself transported to Miss Worthington's Academy for Young Ladies, where the morning light streams through tall windows onto rows of perfectly postured teenage girls, each clutching a fan like a sword waiting to be mastered. The room smells of lavender water and the slight mustiness of old textbooks. But these aren't ordinary lessons in geography or French. You're witnessing the rigorous military-style training that transformed sheltered daughters into masters of silent communication. Miss Hartwell, the deportment instructor, stands at the front of the classroom with the bearing of a cavalry officer and the precision of a clockmaker. Her own fan, a magnificent creation of black lace and sterling silver, moves through practice positions with mechanical perfection. "Ladies," she announces, her voice carrying the authority of someone who could stop a charging horse with a raised eyebrow. Fan language is not a parlor trick. It is survival. You watch 16-year-old Charlotte Pemberton, Mrs. Pemberton's own daughter, struggle with the basic, "I wish to speak with you" position. Her wrist trembles slightly as she attempts to hold her fan at precisely the correct angle against her left cheek. But Miss Hartwell's sharp eyes catch every microscopic error. "Miss Pemberton, your fan is tilted 3 degrees too far forward. In polite society, that transforms 'I wish to speak with you' into 'I find you insufferable.' Hardly the impression you wish to make at the Weatherby Ball next month, I presume." The curriculum is surprisingly comprehensive. You observe as the girls practice what Miss Hartwell calls the 27 essential positions, with the dedication of theological students memorizing scripture. Each position must be held for exactly the right duration. Too brief, and the message might be missed. Too long, and it becomes theatrical overstatement that marks you as provincial, or worse, desperate. The Academy's fan language textbook, disguised as A Lady's Guide to Proper Deportment, contains detailed illustrations that look more like military diagrams than fashion advice. You peek over Charlotte's shoulder as she studies Figure 12, the indication of displeasure through graduated fan movements. The progression from mild annoyance, fan tapped twice against the palm, to complete social dismissal. Fan snapped shut and held vertically against the heart requires the same precision that artillery officers use to calculate cannon trajectory. Historians still argue whether these finishing schools created standardized fan language or simply codified existing practices, but the evidence suggests that institutions like Miss Worthington's Academy served as quality control centers for a communication system that was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The girls weren't just learning etiquette, they were mastering a technology that would determine their social survival. You notice that the practice sessions involve elaborate scenario-based exercises. Miss Hartwell calls out situations. Lady Devonshire approaches with her notorious gossip-mongering daughter. You wish to acknowledge her status while avoiding conversation with the daughter. Execute appropriate fan sequence. The girls respond with complex choreographed movements that would challenge professional dancers, their fans moving through positions that communicate respect, acknowledgement, and polite avoidance simultaneously. The Academy maintains different fans for different lessons. Morning practice uses simple wooden fans that can withstand the inevitable drops and fumbles of novice students. Advanced students graduate to ivory and lace creations that demand delicate handling. The final examination involves navigating a mock social gathering where instructors pose as various social archetypes: the eligible bachelor, the disapproving matron, the rival debutante, while students must maintain appropriate fan communication throughout complex social scenarios. Miss Hartwell demonstrates the dreaded fan language examination, where students must interpret a series of rapid-fire fan signals from across the room. You watch as Charlotte's classmate, Miss Judith Blackwood, correctly identifies 12 consecutive signals, including the subtle difference between "your conversation bores me," fan held vertically against the right temple, and "I have urgent news to share," fan held horizontally against the right temple. The precision required rivals that of professional telegraphers. The penalty system is ruthless. Incorrect fan usage results in additional practice sessions, but more importantly, it means potential social disaster in real-world applications. Miss Hartwell regales the class with cautionary tales of former students who misread fan signals at crucial moments. Young ladies who accidentally agreed to elopements, inadvertently insulted duchesses' daughters, or worst of all, sent signals that were intercepted and misinterpreted by mothers-in-law. You realize that these girls are essentially learning to be bilingual, fluent in both spoken English and gestural fan language. The cognitive load is enormous. Maintaining proper posture, engaging in verbal conversation, monitoring the fan communications of everyone else in the room, and executing your own signals with precision. It's like learning to play chess while reciting poetry and performing ballet simultaneously. The advanced students practice what Miss Hartwell calls fan conversation maintenance, the ability to hold extended dialogues through fan signals while simultaneously engaging in completely different verbal conversations. You watch Charlotte successfully tell her seatmate through fan language that she finds the new music teacher handsome while verbally discussing her embroidery project with Miss Hartwell. The multitasking abilities these girls develop would astound modern computer programmers. You're swept into the grand ballroom of Thornfield Manor, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across silk gowns and polished marble floors. The air thrums with violin music and whispered conversations, but beneath the surface of this glittering social gathering, an entirely different drama unfolds through the subtle language of fans. You're about to witness Victorian courtship in its most elaborate form, a mating ritual so complex it makes peacock displays look like amateur theater. Charlotte Pemberton, now 18 and having graduated from Miss Worthington's Academy with honors in fan deportment, stands near the refreshment table wearing a gown of pale blue silk that cost her father 3 months' income. Her fan, a masterpiece of painted ivory depicting shepherdesses in an idealized pastoral scene, rests delicately in her gloved hands. But this isn't merely decoration. It's her primary weapon in the elaborate battle for a suitable husband. You observe as Captain James Worthington approaches, his military bearing evident even in civilian evening dress. He's been watching Charlotte from across the room, and she's been equally aware of his attention. What follows is a courtship conversation conducted entirely through fan language, while they maintain perfectly appropriate verbal small talk about the weather and the quality of the evening's musical entertainment. Charlotte opens her fan halfway and holds it against her right cheek. "Yes, I am interested in your attention." Captain Worthington responds by adjusting his white gloves in a specific pattern that signals his understanding and reciprocal interest. The verbal conversation continues about the unseasonably warm October weather, but the real communication happens through increasingly elaborate fan choreography. She fans herself slowly with deliberate, measured strokes. "I am currently unattached," while verbally agreeing that the musicians are particularly skilled this evening. He positions himself at precisely the correct distance to indicate serious romantic interest without breaching propriety. While discussing his recent posting in India, the dance of courtship has begun, and you're watching two masters of nonverbal communication negotiate the early stages of what might become a marriage proposal. The complexity becomes evident as other players enter the scene. Mrs. Blackwood, Charlotte's chaperone, watches from a strategically positioned chair near the wall, her own fan moving through warning signals that Charlotte must interpret and respond to while maintaining her conversation with the captain. Meanwhile, Miss Judith Thornfield, the evening's hostess and Charlotte's primary romantic rival, approaches with her own agenda and fan signals. Charlotte's fan work becomes almost gymnastic in its precision. She must simultaneously signal interest to Captain Worthington, acknowledgement and subtle deflection to Miss Thornfield's competitive overtures, and reassurance to Mrs. Blackwood that she's maintaining appropriate behavior. Her fan flutters through positions like a hummingbird navigating a garden, each movement calculated and purposeful. Historians still argue whether such elaborate fan courtships were common or reserved for the highest social circles. But surviving diaries suggest that the practice was widespread among families with matrimonial ambitions. The stakes were enormous. A misread signal could mean the difference between an advantageous marriage and social exile, between financial security and potential destitution. You watch as Captain Worthington executes what appears to be a marriage proposal through fan language proxy. He positions himself so that Charlotte can see his reflection in the mirror behind her, then uses his program card and glove positioning to spell out a complex message. Charlotte's response requires her to fan herself in a specific rhythm while appearing to study the floral arrangements, a signal that means, "I am favorably disposed, but must consult my family." The evening progresses with increasing intensity. Other couples engage in similar fan courtships around the ballroom, creating a symphony of silent communication that operates parallel to the verbal social interactions. You realize that Victorian ballrooms were essentially massive telecommunications centers where dozens of conversations happened simultaneously through coded gestures, with chaperones serving as both facilitators and censors of the system. Charlotte's fan technique reaches its peak during the quadrille, when she must maintain her romantic dialogue with Captain Worthington while dancing with Lord Pembroke, a notoriously tedious but wealthy older gentleman whom her parents favor as a potential suitor. Her fan signals convey apology and continued interest to the captain while maintaining polite acknowledgement of Lord Pembroke's attention, a diplomatic achievement that would challenge seasoned ambassadors. The evening's climax comes when Charlotte must choose between competing suitors through fan language. Captain Worthington and Lord Pembroke have both issued formal romantic inquiries through their respective fan communications, and Charlotte's response will determine not just her romantic future, but her family's financial prospects. The decision plays out through a series of fan positions so subtle that you have to watch her wrist angles to interpret the meaning. You witness the moment when Charlotte's fan comes to rest against her heart, in the position that means "you have won my affection," directed toward Captain Worthington's position across the room. It's a moment of triumph, rejection, and social positioning, all communicated through the angle of painted ivory against blue silk, more dramatic than any spoken declaration, and infinitely more dangerous if intercepted or misunderstood. You slip into the shadowy alcove behind the heavy velvet curtains where the most dangerous fan conversations take place, the ones that could destroy marriages, ruin reputations, and send shockwaves through Victorian society's carefully constructed facade. Here, in these hidden corners of drawing rooms and behind the marble columns of grand estates, fans spoke messages that polite society pretended didn't exist. Lady Margaret Ashworth adjusts her black lace fan with trembling fingers as she waits for her clandestine meeting with Sir William Hartwell. Yes, the same family that produced Miss Hartwell, the deportment instructor. Lady Margaret is married to the considerably older Lord Ashworth, a man whose interests run more toward his prize-winning roses than his considerably younger wife. The fan in her hands carries messages that could lead to scandal, divorce, and social exile if discovered. She holds her fan in the position that means "meet me at the conservatory at midnight," a signal so dangerous that most finishing schools taught it only as a cautionary example of fan language misuse. But Lady Margaret is desperate for connection, for romance, for anything beyond the suffocating propriety of her arranged marriage. Her fan becomes her lifeline to a world of forbidden possibilities. You observe as Sir William appears, his own signals carefully disguised as casual grooming gestures. He adjusts his cufflinks in a pattern that means, "I understand and reciprocate your feelings," while verbally discussing the evening's political developments with another gentleman. The conversation they're really having involves arrangements for secret meetings, protestations of love, and increasingly urgent requests for more intimate encounters. The vocabulary of forbidden fan language is remarkably sophisticated. A fan held at half-mast against the bodice means, "My husband is suspicious." Drawing the fan slowly across the throat signals, "We must end this affair immediately." Perhaps most dangerously, a fan pressed firmly against both lips means, "I will leave my husband for you." A message that, if intercepted, could result in legal proceedings, social ostracism, and financial ruin. Mrs. Caroline Worthington, Captain James's elder sister and a widow with her own secrets, demonstrates the art of triangulated fan communication, where dangerous messages are relayed through intermediaries to avoid direct detection. She fans herself in patterns that convey information to Lady Margaret about Sir William's intentions, while Lady Margaret responds with signals meant for Sir William, but readable by Mrs. Worthington. It's like watching a three-way telegraph system operated entirely through silk and ivory. The risk management strategies these women develop would impress modern intelligence operatives. They establish decoy signals, fan movements that appear to carry romantic messages, but actually discuss mundane topics like household management or charity work. They create alibis through coordinated fan conversations with trusted friends who can provide alternative explanations for suspicious behavior. They even develop emergency signals that can abort dangerous communications when chaperones or spouses approach unexpectedly. Historians still argue whether such elaborate adultery networks actually existed or represent Victorian moral panic fiction. But surviving letters and diary entries suggest that fan language provided crucial infrastructure for extramarital relationships in a society that offered few legal avenues for marital escape. The fans became tools of rebellion against a system that trapped women in loveless marriages with no possibility of divorce. You witness the tragic consequences when fan signals are misinterpreted. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornfield, Judith's aunt and a woman of previously unblemished reputation, accidentally signals romantic availability to Lord Pembroke during a garden party, not realizing that her innocent fan adjustment has been read as an invitation for an affair. The resulting scandal destroys her social standing when Lord Pembroke's aggressive pursuit becomes public knowledge, and she lacks the fan language sophistication to clarify her innocent intentions. The most dangerous signals involve what the ladies call extreme measures, fan communications that suggest suicide, elopement, or other desperate actions. A fan held upside down against the heart means, "I would rather die than continue this way." A fan twisted in both hands suggests, "I am planning to flee." These signals required immediate response and intervention from the underground network of women who understood the desperate circumstances that drove such communications. Perhaps most remarkably, you discover that some Victorian ladies developed what amounts to fan language encryption, personalized variations on standard signals that could only be interpreted by specific recipients. Lady Margaret and Sir William create their own private vocabulary where traditional signals are inverted or modified, allowing them to communicate in plain sight even when surrounded by other fluent fan speakers. The psychological toll of maintaining these secret communications becomes evident as you watch Lady Margaret's health deteriorate under the strain of constant vigilance. Every fan movement must be calculated, every gesture analyzed for potential misinterpretation, every moment of inattention potentially disastrous. The mental energy required to maintain elaborate deceptions through fan language while navigating normal social obligations would challenge the most skilled performers. The network of women who facilitate these dangerous communications develops its own culture of mutual protection and shared risk. They create elaborate systems of coded support, warning signals that can be transmitted across entire ballrooms, and emergency procedures for when affairs are discovered or marriages become unbearable. Their fans become instruments of feminine solidarity in a world that offered women few other forms of mutual aid. You find yourself traveling across the Atlantic to discover that fan language, like a persistent whisper, had evolved differently in every corner of the Victorian world. In the salons of New York's Fifth Avenue, American debutantes wielded their fans with the brash confidence of a nation that had recently fought a civil war, while in the drawing rooms of Paris, French sophisticates had refined fan communication into something approaching high art. Each culture had taken this silent language and molded it to fit their own social needs and romantic temperaments. In Boston's Beacon Hill, you observe Mrs. Prudence Whitworth demonstrating what Americans call frontier fan language, a streamlined version of the European system that eliminates much of the elaborate ceremony in favor of direct, practical communication. American ladies, influenced by their nation's frontier spirit and democratic ideals, have developed fan signals that would make their English cousins blush with embarrassment at their directness. The American version includes signals like, "I find you interesting, but refuse to play coy games about it," executed by opening the fan completely and holding it at shoulder height, a gesture that would be considered scandalously forward in London, but perfectly acceptable in Philadelphia. American fan language also incorporates uniquely New World concepts. There's actually a specific signal for, "I'm more interested in your financial prospects than your personality," involving a specific twirling motion that European ladies would never dare execute in public. You cross to Paris, where Madame Dubois holds court in her silk-draped salon, teaching French variations that emphasize subtlety and innuendo over the more direct English approach. French fan language includes an entire vocabulary for discussing philosophical concepts. There are specific signals for indicating whether you're a romantic or a realist, whether you prefer Voltaire or Rousseau, and even your opinion on the latest operatic performances at the Palais Garnier. The French have developed what they call fan impressionism, rapid, almost unconscious fan movements that convey emotional states rather than specific messages. A French lady might flutter her fan in patterns that suggest melancholy, passion, or intellectual excitement without ever forming concrete words or phrases. It's poetry written in silk and ivory, requiring the kind of cultural sophistication that made Paris the artistic capital of the world. German fan language, as you observe in Berlin's most fashionable drawing rooms, reflects that nation's reputation for precision and philosophical depth. German ladies have systematized fan communication with scientific rigor, creating detailed taxonomies of gestures that correspond to complex emotional and intellectual concepts. They've even developed fan signals for discussing Kant's categorical imperative and Hegel's dialectical method, because apparently even romantic communication must serve the pursuit of higher learning. Historians still argue whether these regional variations developed independently or influenced each other through international travel and correspondence. But the evidence suggests a fascinating cross-pollination of ideas, as wealthy families traveled between European capitals and American cities, carrying their fan traditions with them like cultural ambassadors. In Vienna, you discover that Austrian fan language has been influenced by the city's musical heritage, with signals timed to match waltz rhythms and fan movements that mirror the mathematical precision of Mozart's compositions. Viennese ladies literally dance their fan conversations, creating a hybrid art form that combines gesture, music, and social communication in ways that would influence European dance culture for generations. The Spanish approach proves most dramatic, incorporating elements from centuries of Moorish cultural influence and the passionate temperament associated with Iberian culture. Spanish fan language includes gestures so expressive they border on theatrical performance, with movements that can convey tragic passion or comedic dismissal with equal effectiveness. The Spanish fan becomes less a communication tool than a prop in an ongoing romantic drama. In the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, Russian aristocrats have developed fan signals adapted to their unique social structure and political climate. Russian fan language includes coded discussions of political opinions, dangerous in a society where the wrong word about the Tsar could result in exile to Siberia. Russian ladies use their fans to identify political allies, warn of informants, and even discuss revolutionary ideas, making their gatherings hotbeds of political intrigue, disguised as fashionable social events. The colonial variations prove particularly fascinating. In British India, English memsahibs have adapted traditional fan language to include signals relevant to colonial life, warnings about native uprisings, communications about the reliability of local servants, and coded discussions of the political situation. The fans become tools of imperial administration as much as social communication. Even within England itself, regional variations emerge. Yorkshire ladies develop more direct, practical signals, reflecting their county's reputation for plain speaking, while Cornwall's maritime culture influences fan language that includes nautical metaphors and timing based on tidal patterns. The Lake District's literary associations create fan signals that reference romantic poetry, allowing ladies to quote Wordsworth through gesture alone. You realize that fan language represents one of history's first truly international communication systems, spreading across continents and adapting to local cultures while maintaining core principles that allowed a lady from Boston to communicate, however imperfectly, with a countess from Vienna. It's a remarkable example of cultural globalization, decades before the term existed. Proof that human ingenuity will always find ways to transcend the barriers that society attempts to impose on communication and connection. You enter the hidden workshops of London's most exclusive fan makers, where the scent of lacquer and silk mingles with the whispered conversations of craftsmen who understand that they're not just creating accessories, they're manufacturing the infrastructure of secret communication. These artisans, working in cramped rooms above fashionable shops in Bond Street and Regent Street, have become unwitting conspirators in Victorian society's most elaborate communication network. Master craftsman William du Villeroy, whose family name has become synonymous with the finest European fans, examines a special commission from a mysterious client. The fan appears conventional, painted silk, stretched over ivory ribs, decorated with pastoral scenes of shepherds and shepherdesses. But hidden within its construction are modifications that would make it the perfect tool for covert communication. The ribs are weighted differently to create specific clicking sounds when opened and closed, essentially turning the fan into a percussive instrument for coded messages. You observe as du Villeroy's apprentices work on what they call conversation fans, pieces specifically designed for extended fan language dialogues. These fans feature reinforced hinges that can withstand hours of continuous use without loosening, specially treated silk that won't show wear from repeated folding, and ivory ribs carved with subtle texture variations that allow users to identify specific positions by touch alone, enabling fan communication even in dimly lit ballrooms. The most intriguing creations are the diplomatic fans, commissioned by the wives of ambassadors and foreign ministers. These fans incorporate design elements that can convey information about international relations, trade negotiations, and political alliances through their decorative patterns. A fan painted with roses and lilies might seem like innocent floral decoration, but to trained observers, the specific arrangement of flowers could indicate the current state of Anglo-French relations or hint at upcoming treaty negotiations. Du Villeroy shows you examples of encoding fans, pieces where the painted decoration itself contains hidden messages. Using techniques borrowed from medieval manuscript illumination, the artists embed coded information in seemingly decorative elements. A pastoral scene might contain shepherds, positioned to spell out specific letters, or flowers arranged in patterns that convey numerical codes. These fans serve as portable libraries of encrypted information, allowing ladies to carry sensitive data hidden in plain sight. The technical innovations required for specialized fan language surprise you with their sophistication. Some fans feature hidden compartments within the handles where tiny written messages can be concealed. Others incorporate mirrors positioned at specific angles that allow users to observe reflected fan signals from across crowded rooms. The most advanced models include mechanical elements, tiny springs and levers that create specific tactile feedback when fans are positioned correctly, allowing for communication through touch alone. Historians still argue whether fan makers were conscious participants in these communication networks, or simply responded to customer demands for more durable and versatile accessories. But evidence suggests that many craftsmen understood exactly how their creations would be used. Price lists from the period include cryptic references to conversation models and extended use designs that cost significantly more than standard decorative fans. You discover that certain fan makers specialized in what they discreetly called ladies' diplomatic accessories. These workshops, often located in the less fashionable areas of London, created fans specifically designed for carrying state secrets, conducting international espionage, and facilitating political negotiations. The wives of diplomats and politicians became informal intelligence networks, using their fans to communicate information that couldn't be transmitted through official channels. The quality control process for these specialized fans is remarkably rigorous. Each piece must pass tests for durability, precision, and discretion before being approved for sale. Test procedures include extended use trials, where fans are subjected to hours of continuous opening and closing, precision measurements to ensure consistent positioning capabilities, and even sound tests to verify that the mechanical clicking of the ribs produces the correct coded patterns. The workshop maintains a library of fan language guides disguised as fashion catalogs, providing customers with detailed instructions for using their purchases effectively. These guides, written in flowery language that appears to discuss aesthetic preferences and style choices, actually contain comprehensive tutorials on advanced fan communication techniques, including methods for conducting conversations across crowded rooms and strategies for avoiding detection by suspicious chaperones. You observe the creation of matched sets, pairs of fans designed to work together for coordinated communication between friends, lovers, or conspirators. These sets feature complementary designs and synchronized mechanical elements that allow users to execute complex collaborative signals. One fan might ask a question through its positioning, while the matching fan provides the answer through corresponding movements, creating seamless dialogues that appear to be coincidental fashion choices. The most exclusive commissions involve fans designed for specific historical events. Duvaleri's workshop has created pieces for royal weddings, diplomatic receptions, and international exhibitions, with each fan incorporating design elements that reference the specific occasion while providing the communication capabilities needed for that particular social environment. These fans become historical artifacts, capturing both the artistic sensibilities and the hidden communication needs of their era. The economic impact of this specialized fan industry is substantial. The workshops employ dozens of craftsmen, from silk painters to ivory carvers to mechanical engineers who design the hidden mechanisms that make advanced fan communication possible. The industry represents one of the first examples of technology designed specifically for covert communication, predating modern encryption devices by decades, while serving similar functions in society's information networks. You find yourself positioned behind a marble pillar in Lady Thornfield's drawing room, watching the eternal battle between determined daughters and vigilant mothers unfold through the most sophisticated surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques the Victorian era could devise. The air crackles with tension as elaborate fan communications clash with equally sophisticated maternal oversight systems, creating a cold war of gestures and glances that would make international spies envious of its complexity. Mrs. Pemberton has positioned herself strategically near the French doors, her own fan moving through what she calls supervisory patterns, signals designed to monitor and control her daughter Charlotte's romantic communications. Her fan language vocabulary includes specific warnings like, "Your behavior is being noted," fan held vertically against the left temple, and "Cease that conversation immediately," fan snapped shut and held horizontally across the bodice. She's developed the kind of maternal radar that can detect inappropriate fan flirtation from across a crowded ballroom. Charlotte, now a master of what finishing schools discreetly taught as evasive fan techniques, has learned to conduct romantic conversations while appearing to comply with her mother's oversight. She's perfected the art of using reflective surfaces, mirrors, polished silver, even the glass covering framed paintings, to maintain visual contact with Captain Worthington, while appearing to focus attention on socially appropriate targets like elderly relatives or married women. You observe the development of what both sides call proxy fan communication, using trusted intermediaries to relay messages when direct communication becomes impossible. Charlotte's friend Miss Sarah Blackwood serves as a living telegraph system, receiving fan signals from Charlotte and transmitting them to Captain Worthington, while maintaining her own conversation with Mrs. Pemberton about embroidery patterns and charitable work. The mental gymnastics required to maintain 3 separate conversations simultaneously would challenge professional diplomats. Mrs. Pemberton, however, has developed counterintelligence techniques that would impress Scotland Yard detectives. She's learned to read proxy communications, identifying the telltale signs that indicate when seemingly innocent conversations are actually serving as relay systems for romantic messages. Her response involves what she calls communication interdiction, positioning herself strategically to break sightlines. introducing conversational topics that require sustained attention, and even creating deliberate social complications that force her daughter to focus on immediate propriety rather than long-distance romance. The generational warfare escalates as Charlotte develops increasingly sophisticated concealment techniques. She's learned to conduct fan conversations using her peripheral vision, maintaining eye contact with appropriate social targets, while actually focusing on romantic communications happening at the edge of her visual field. She's also mastered the art of conversational camouflage, conducting romantic fan dialogues while verbally discussing topics so boring that chaperones lose interest and reduce their surveillance intensity. Historians still argue whether such elaborate parent-child surveillance battles were common or limited to the highest social circles. But surviving letters between mothers suggest that maternal counterintelligence techniques were widely shared and continuously refined. Mothers developed their own networks for sharing information about effective surveillance strategies, warning systems for identifying problematic romantic attachments, and emergency procedures for preventing elopements and inappropriate marriages. You witness the tragic consequences when these surveillance systems fail. Miss Elizabeth Worthington, Captain James's younger sister, successfully evades her mother's fan language monitoring long enough to arrange a secret engagement with a charming but financially unsuitable young man. The elaborate deception involves coordinated fan communications between multiple conspirators, false signal patterns designed to mislead parental surveillance, and even the creation of decoy romantic interests to misdirect maternal attention. The discovery of Elizabeth's secret engagement triggers what can only be described as a fan language arms race. Mrs. Worthington develops advanced surveillance techniques including coordinated observation with other mothers, systematic monitoring of her daughter's friend networks, and even the recruitment of servants who can report on suspicious fan communications. Elizabeth responds with increasingly desperate concealment strategies that eventually require the involvement of professional accomplices, dressmakers who can conceal written messages in clothing alterations, and carriage drivers who can facilitate secret meetings. The psychological toll on both sides becomes evident as you observe the constant vigilance required for these elaborate games of deception and detection. Mothers must maintain continuous surveillance while appearing to engage in normal social activities, monitoring their daughters' fan communications while conducting their own conversations and social obligations. Daughters must execute complex romantic communications while maintaining perfect facade of filial obedience and social propriety. Perhaps most remarkably, you discover that some families develop what amounts to negotiated fan communication agreements, formal understandings about acceptable levels of romantic communication under maternal supervision. These agreements establish boundaries for courtship conversations, create approved signal vocabularies that mothers can monitor without interfering, and even include provisions for escalating romantic communications as courtships progress toward formal engagement announcements. The most successful mothers learn to use fan language as a tool for facilitating appropriate romantic connections, rather than simply preventing inappropriate ones. Mrs. Blackwood has perfected the art of guided courtship fan communication, using her own fan signals to direct suitable gentlemen toward her daughter, while discouraging unsuitable attention through coordinated surveillance and interference techniques. The elaborate surveillance and counter-surveillance systems ultimately create a generation of women with intelligence gathering and deception skills that would serve them well in any profession requiring strategic thinking and careful observation. These ladies become masters of reading subtle social cues, detecting deception, and maintaining complex cover stories while pursuing their objectives through hostile social environments. You step into the eye of a Victorian social hurricane, where fan language has gone catastrophically wrong, and the consequences are about to destroy lives, fortunes, and reputations with the efficiency of a well-aimed cannon. The year is 1878, and you're witnessing what historians would later call the Great Fan Language Scandal of Belgravia, a series of misinterpreted signals that triggered duels, divorces, and social exile across London's most exclusive circles. The disaster begins with what seems like a simple misunderstanding. Lady Catherine Worthington, attending the Duchess of Marlborough's autumn reception, adjusts her fan in what she believes is a casual, meaningless gesture. Unfortunately, Lord Frederick Pemberton, a man notorious for his romantic delusions and poor eyesight, interprets her fan position as a passionate declaration of love and an invitation for an immediate elopement. The fact that Lady Catherine is happily married to his business partner only makes the resulting chaos more spectacular. You watch in horror as Lord Frederick approaches Lady Catherine with the confidence of a man who believes he's responding to a romantic summons. His own signals, executed with theatrical enthusiasm, involve elaborate handkerchief flourishes and walking stick positioning that draw the attention of every fan-literate person in the room. Within minutes, the entire reception is buzzing with whispered speculation about Lady Catherine's apparent infidelity and Lord Frederick's scandalous pursuit of a married woman. The situation spirals completely out of control when Captain James Worthington, Lady Catherine's brother-in-law and a man with a hair-trigger temper, misinterprets the chaos as evidence that Lord Frederick has insulted his family's honor. His challenge to a duel, delivered through a series of aggressive fan signals relayed by his sister Charlotte, is unfortunately intercepted and misread by Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, who believes she's witnessing her son being challenged to a duel over a completely different matter involving gambling debts and a disputed horse race. What follows is a cascade of misunderstandings that spreads through London society like a plague of confusion. Lady Catherine's attempts to clarify her innocent intentions are misread as increasingly desperate romantic appeals. Lord Frederick's confusion about the hostile reception to his perceived romantic success leads him to make increasingly inappropriate gestures that confirm everyone's worst suspicions about his intentions. Captain Worthington's demand for satisfaction is interpreted as evidence of his own romantic interest in Lady Catherine, suggesting an incestuous scandal that sends shockwaves through the interconnected web of Victorian family relationships. The fan language breakdown reveals the fundamental vulnerability of a communication system based entirely on visual interpretation without verification mechanisms. You witness how quickly social order collapses when the shared understanding that makes fan language possible begins to fracture. Messages become garbled, intentions are misconstrued, and the elaborate system of nonverbal communication that normally facilitates social interaction becomes a weapon of mass destruction. Historians still argue whether the Belgravia scandal was an isolated incident or representative of systemic problems with fan language communication. But contemporary newspapers suggest that similar misunderstandings were more common than Victorian society cared to admit. The scandal exposes the dangerous gap between fan language theory as taught in finishing schools and the chaotic reality of implementing complex nonverbal communication in high-stress social environments. The consequences proved devastating for everyone involved. Lady Catherine, despite her complete innocence, finds herself socially ostracized as rumors about her supposed romantic entanglements spread throughout London. Her husband, Lord Worthington, faces a crisis of confidence in both his marriage and his business partnership with Lord Frederick's father. The family's social standing, built over generations of careful reputation management, crumbles within weeks of the initial misunderstanding. Lord Frederick's romantic delusions ultimately lead to his complete social exile when his increasingly desperate attempts to clarify the situation only confirm everyone's belief that he's either mentally unstable or morally corrupt. His family, prominent in banking circles, suffers financial consequences as business relationships deteriorate and social connections evaporate. The young man who began the evening believing he was responding to romantic encouragement ends it facing potential banishment from London society. The duel between Captain Worthington and Lord Frederick takes place at dawn in Hyde Park, witnessed by seconds who are themselves confused about the actual reasons for the combat. The fact that both men are fighting over misinterpreted fan signals that neither fully understands adds an element of tragic absurdity to the proceedings. Captain Worthington's bullet grazes Lord Frederick's shoulder, while Lord Frederick's shot goes wide, but the social damage proves far more serious than the physical wounds. Perhaps most tragically, you observe how the scandal destroys the elaborate network of female friendship and mutual support that had developed around fan language communication. Ladies who had previously shared signals and collaborated in romantic communications begin to suspect each other of deliberate sabotage and malicious misinterpretation. The trust that made fan language possible evaporates as everyone becomes convinced that their friends are deliberately creating confusion for their own advantage. The aftermath includes a series of what can only be described as fan language show trials, where social leaders attempt to establish definitive interpretations of the disputed signals. These gatherings, held in drawing rooms across Belgravia and Mayfair, feature elaborate reconstructions of the original incident, expert testimony from finishing school instructors, and heated debates about proper fan language protocol that reveal just how subjective and unreliable the entire system actually was. The great fan language scandal of Belgravia ultimately serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of relying on complex nonverbal communication systems without adequate verification and clarification mechanisms. But it also demonstrates the incredible social power that Victorian ladies wielded through their mastery of these subtle arts of silent conversation. You find yourself in the gentlemen's clubs of St. James's Street, where cigar smoke mingles with whispered conversations about the mysterious communication methods that Victorian ladies seemed to wield with supernatural effectiveness. While women perfected their fan language, men were desperately developing their own systems of silent communication, creating what amounts to a masculine parallel universe of coded gestures using walking sticks, pocket watches, and cigar protocols that would make a Freemason proud. Lord Pemberton adjusts his gold pocket watch with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker, executing what gentlemen discreetly call timepiece telegraphing. The angle at which he holds the watch, the number of times he checks it, and the specific method he uses to return it to his waistcoat pocket all convey information to other men who understand the system. His current sequence means, "I am romantically interested in the lady in blue silk," followed by, "but her chaperone is formidable," and concluding with, "assistance requested in creating a distraction." Captain Worthington responds with what military men have refined into walking stick semaphore, a system borrowed from naval flag communications and adapted for use with elegant mahogany canes. He taps his stick against his left boot twice, touches the silver handle to his lapel, and then rests the stick against his right shoulder in a sequence that translates to, "Acknowledged, will create diversion, proceed with your approach." The conversation takes place entirely through wooden accessories, while both men maintain perfectly appropriate verbal discussions about the weather and recent parliamentary proceedings. You observe the development of cigar diplomacy, perhaps the most sophisticated element of masculine nonverbal communication. The way a gentleman lights his cigar, the angle at which he holds it, the pattern of smoke rings he creates, and even the method he uses to extinguish it all carry specific meanings within the male social hierarchy. Sir William Hartwell's elaborate cigar ritual currently signals, "I have important information about Lady Margaret's husband," followed by, "Meet me in the card room," and ending with, "Extreme discretion required." The gentleman's system proves particularly sophisticated in matters of financial communication. Specific combinations of watch checking and walking stick positioning can convey information about stock prices, business opportunities, and investment advice without alerting competing businessmen who might be listening to verbal conversations. The London Exchange operates partially through these silent signals, with fortunes made and lost through carefully choreographed sequences of masculine accessories. You discover that men have developed glove protocols that rival the complexity of feminine fan language. The way a gentleman removes his gloves, the specific fingers he adjusts, the manner in which he holds them while not wearing them, all of these details convey coded information. A glove held in the right hand with the thumb pointing downward means I am experiencing financial difficulties, while the same glove held with fingers pointing upward signals I have investment capital available. Military men, with their professional background in tactical communication, have created the most advanced masculine signaling systems. Veterans of the Crimean War have adapted battlefield communication techniques for use in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs. creating networks that can transmit complex information across entire social gatherings without verbal communication. Their system includes emergency signals for warning about suspicious activities, coordinated responses to social threats, and even tactical retreats from uncomfortable social situations. Historians still argue whether these masculine communication systems developed independently or in direct response to women's fan language mastery. But evidence suggests that men felt increasingly disadvantaged by their inability to participate in the sophisticated, nonverbal conversations that women conducted so effortlessly. The development of parallel masculine systems represents an attempt to level the social communication playing field. The integration between masculine and feminine communication systems creates fascinating cross-gender conversations where walking stick signals respond to fan communications, creating hybrid dialogues that span traditional social boundaries. You witness Captain Worthington and Charlotte Pemberton conducting a courtship conversation where his walking stick positioning responds to her fan signals, creating a romantic dialogue that operates entirely outside verbal communication while appearing to be coincidental movements of fashionable accessories. The most elaborate masculine communication involves what gentlemen call layered signaling, simultaneous use of multiple accessories to convey complex multi-part messages. A gentleman might use his pocket watch to establish the topic, his walking stick to convey his opinion, his gloves to indicate urgency, and his cigar to suggest appropriate responses. The cognitive load required to maintain such conversations while engaging in normal social activities challenges even the most socially skilled men. You observe the tragic consequences when masculine communication systems fail or are misinterpreted. Lord Frederick's misreading of Captain Worthington's walking stick signals leads to a business investment disaster that costs both men significant fortunes. The captain's stick position, intended to warn about questionable railroad stock, is interpreted as enthusiastic endorsement, leading to financial losses that strain their friendship and damage their family relationships. The psychological pressure of maintaining these complex masculine communication systems proves particularly challenging for men who lack natural aptitude for nonverbal expression. You witness several gentlemen suffering what can only be described as signaling anxiety. Constant worry about misinterpreting or incorrectly executing the coded communications that have become essential for social and business success. Perhaps most remarkably, you discover that some progressive couples develop integrated communication systems where masculine and feminine signaling methods work together in coordinated fashion, creating household-level intelligence networks that can function across social boundaries and facilitate complex family strategies for advancement in Victorian society's competitive environment. You find yourself in the glittering Crystal Palace during Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebrations, where the air crackles with more than just ceremonial pageantry. Beneath the diplomatic smiles and elaborate court protocol, the wives of Europe's most powerful ambassadors are conducting negotiations that could redraw continental borders, all through the delicate dance of painted silk and mother of pearl. You're about to witness fan language at its most dangerous and sophisticated, where a misinterpreted flutter could trigger international incidents and a well-timed gesture might prevent wars. The Duchess of Marlborough glides through the reception with the confidence of someone who holds state secrets in her ivory fan ribs. As wife to one of Britain's most influential diplomats, she's become an unofficial ambassador herself, using her mastery of international fan protocols to conduct conversations that would be impossible through official channels. Her fan, a masterpiece of French craftsmanship, decorated with scenes of Anglo-French cooperation, carries modifications that transform it into a diplomatic instrument capable of conveying complex international intelligence. You observe as she approaches Countess von Habsburg, whose own fan, adorned with Austrian imperial eagles, moves through greeting sequences that acknowledge not just personal recognition, but the current state of Austro-British relations. The Countess's opening fan position signals our governments maintain cordial relations, while her subsequent gesture adds, "But my husband seeks clarification on the Eastern question." Within moments, two women have initiated a diplomatic dialogue that their husbands couldn't conduct without triggering formal protocols and international scrutiny. The complexity of diplomatic fan language staggers you with its sophistication. These women have developed signal systems that can discuss trade agreements, military alliances, territorial disputes, and succession crises through gesture alone. The Duchess's response to the Austrian inquiry involves a complex sequence. Fan held against the left temple, Britain's position remains unchanged, followed by a drawing motion across the heart. But we value Austrian friendship. Concluding with the fan rested against her right shoulder. Private discussion recommended. Madame Delacroix, wife of the French ambassador, joins the conversation with her own fan, creating what amounts to a three-way international summit, disguised as ladies discussing the evening's entertainment. Her fan, decorated with scenes from Versailles, carries signals that can reference specific treaty articles, trade negotiations, and even intelligence about Russian military movements. The three women conduct discussions that would require weeks of formal diplomatic correspondence, all while maintaining perfect facades of social pleasantry. You discover that these diplomatic fan languages require specialized training that goes far beyond finishing school protocols. The wives of senior diplomats attend discreet instruction sessions where they learn to communicate complex political concepts, military intelligence, and economic data through fan gestures. They master signal systems that can reference specific treaty clauses, territorial boundaries, and international law concepts, essentially becoming walking encyclopedias of coded political communication. The stakes of diplomatic fan miscommunication prove terrifyingly high. You witness the aftermath of what historians would later call the Morocco Crisis fan incident, where Baroness von Seckendorf's misinterpretation of Lady Aberdeen's fan signal about German colonial interests nearly triggered a diplomatic crisis between Britain and Germany. The Baroness read Lady Aberdeen's cautious interest signal as complete opposition, leading to a series of increasingly aggressive diplomatic responses that required weeks of official clarification to resolve. The international aspect creates fascinating challenges as different nations' fan traditions must be reconciled for diplomatic purposes. Russian diplomatic fan language emphasizes dramatic gestures reflecting Slavic cultural expressiveness, while German signals favor precise, methodical movements that mirror their reputation for systematic thinking. Italian diplomatic wives incorporate operatic flourishes that can convey emotional undertones alongside political information, while Scandinavian fan protocols emphasize understated efficiency that reflects Nordic cultural values. You observe the development of what these women call neutral diplomatic fan vocabulary, standardized signals that can be understood across cultural boundaries without favoring any particular nation's traditional fan language. These universal diplomatic signals allow British ambassadors' wives to communicate effectively with their Ottoman, Chinese, and Japanese counterparts, despite vastly different cultural backgrounds and fan traditions. The security implications fascinate you as much as they would concern modern intelligence agencies. Diplomatic wives develop elaborate counterintelligence techniques to protect their fan communications from hostile observation. They create decoy signal patterns, use mirrors and reflective surfaces to monitor potential eavesdroppers, and even employ loyal servants who can provide false interpretations of intercepted fan signals to protect genuine diplomatic intelligence. Perhaps most remarkably, you discover evidence of what amounts to an international intelligence network operated entirely by diplomatic wives using fan language. Lady Pembroke maintains correspondence with Countess Andrecy in Vienna, Marquise de Pompadour in Paris, and Princess Volkonsky in St. Petersburg, creating an information network that spans Europe and provides intelligence that sometimes reaches government officials before official diplomatic channels deliver the same information. The psychological pressure of conducting international diplomacy through fan signals proves enormous. These women must maintain perfect social facades while processing complex political information, executing precise diplomatic communications, and managing the constant risk that misinterpreted signals could damage their husbands' careers or even trigger international conflicts. The mental strain would challenge professional intelligence operatives trained specifically for such pressures. The most classified communications involve what these women discreetly call succession fan protocols, signals designed to discuss the complex web of European royal marriages, potential inheritance crises, and dynastic disputes that could reshape continental politics. These conversations require fan vocabulary so specialized that only a handful of women in each generation master the complete system, making them invaluable informal advisors to their nation's foreign policy establishments. You find yourself in the drawing room of Lady Pemberton's Mayfair townhouse in 1895. But something has changed. The once vibrant atmosphere of silent communication has grown strangely quiet, and you notice that many of the younger ladies carry fans more as fashionable accessories than as instruments of sophisticated dialogue. You're witnessing the beginning of the end, the slow death of a communication system that had ruled Victorian society for decades, killed not by scandal or suppression, but by the relentless march of technological progress and changing social attitudes. The death knell arrives in the form of Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, which has begun appearing in the homes of London's wealthiest families. You watch as Charlotte Pemberton, now Mrs. Worthington and a mother of 3, demonstrates the new device to her teenage daughter with a mixture of fascination and melancholy. Simply speak into this apparatus, Margaret, and your voice travels through wires to another house entirely, she explains, while her own fan hangs forgotten at her wrist, its painted silk no longer necessary for long-distance communication. The irony is palpable. Victorian ladies spent decades perfecting a silent language that could communicate across crowded ballrooms, only to be replaced by a machine that allows them to speak directly across entire cities. The telephone eliminates the need for elaborate coded conversations, making fan language seem suddenly antiquated and unnecessarily complex. Why master 37 different fan positions when you can simply pick up a speaking tube and say exactly what you mean? You observe the generational divide that emerges as newer technologies make their appearance. Margaret Worthington, Charlotte's daughter, regards her mother's fan collection with the same polite bewilderment that modern teenagers might show toward telegraph equipment. But mother, why would anyone choose to communicate through such complicated gestures when they could simply write a letter or make a telephone call, she asks, unable to comprehend a world where direct communication was so socially dangerous that women invented an entire silent language to circumvent social restrictions. The changing fashion contributes to fan language's decline in ways that prove surprisingly practical. The new Gibson girl style, with its more athletic silhouette and casual elegance, doesn't accommodate the elaborate fan work that Victorian communication required. The corseted posture that made precise fan positioning possible gives way to more natural movement that makes subtle gestural communication nearly impossible to execute with the required precision. Electric lighting deals another devastating blow to fan language viability. You witness the installation of Edison's incandescent bulbs in Lady Thornfield's ballroom, where the harsh, steady light eliminates the romantic shadows and flickering illumination that had made fan language both necessary and possible. Under electric lighting, every gesture becomes visible to everyone in the room, destroying the subtle privacy that had made fan communication so effective for secret conversations. The emergence of the new woman movement creates ideological opposition to fan language that proves more damaging than any technological innovation. Progressive ladies like Miss Judith Blackwood, now a university-educated suffragette, actively reject fan communication as a symbol of feminine oppression and artificial social restrictions. Why should we communicate through coded gestures when we have voices and minds capable of direct expression? She argues at women's rights meetings, viewing fan language as a relic of the same patriarchal system that denied women legal equality and educational opportunities. You witness poignant scenes where older ladies attempt to pass on fan language knowledge to daughters and granddaughters who show little interest in mastering such elaborate skills. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, now in her 70s, tries to teach her granddaughter the basic fan positions, but the girl's attention wanders constantly to her bicycle, her tennis racket, and her university entrance examinations, symbols of a generation that has access to freedoms that made fan language necessary in the first place. The professional infrastructure that supported fan language begins to collapse as demand disappears. Miss Hartwell's Academy for Young Ladies reduces its fan language instruction from daily lessons to optional weekly sessions, and finally eliminates the curriculum entirely when enrollment drops to single digits. The specialized fan makers who created conversation models and diplomatic accessories find themselves reduced to producing simple decorative fans for export to colonial markets, where Victorian customs persist longer than in England itself. Perhaps most tellingly, you observe the transformation of fan language from practical communication tool to nostalgic curiosity. Society magazines begin publishing articles about the quaint customs of our mother's generation, treating fan language as historical artifact rather than living tradition. The same signals that once carried the power to start romances or prevent scandals become parlor entertainment for ladies who perform fan gestures as historical reenactment rather than genuine communication. The great lore delivers the final blow to whatever remained of fan language tradition. You witness the transformation of British society as young men march off to trenches and young women enter factories, hospitals, and government offices. The elaborate social restrictions that made fan language necessary evaporate in the face of national emergency, as women gain access to direct participation in political, economic, and social life that their grandmothers could only influence through coded gestures. By 1920, you find yourself in the same drawing rooms where fan language once flourished, now occupied by women who smoke cigarettes, drive automobiles, and vote in elections. The fans that remain serve purely decorative functions, their communication potential as forgotten as the social restrictions that had made such elaborate circumvention necessary. The last practitioners of true fan language have become elderly curiosities, occasionally demonstrating their forgotten skills to amused granddaughters who regard such complexity as charmingly obsolete. The decline proves so complete that when historians begin studying Victorian fan language in the 1960s, they struggle to decode signals that had once been as common as spoken conversation. The living tradition dies with its practitioners, leaving behind only fragmentary evidence in letters, diaries, and instruction manuals that provide tantalizing glimpses of a communication system that had once been sophisticated enough to conduct international diplomacy and intimate enough to facilitate secret love affairs. You find yourself standing before the gilt-framed masterpiece Lady Pemberton's afternoon reception in the National Portrait Gallery. But you're no longer just admiring the brushwork and composition. Armed with your newfound knowledge of Victorian fan language, you begin to decode the hidden conversations frozen in oil paint and discover that this seemingly innocent social scene actually documents one of the most scandalous fan language exchanges in London society. The artists weren't just capturing fashion and social customs, they were creating permanent records of secret communications that the subjects never intended to preserve for posterity. The revelation transforms your understanding of Victorian art entirely. That elegant lady in blue silk positioned near the window isn't simply posing. Her fan placement against her left cheek clearly signals no to someone across the room. The gentleman adjusting his gloves in the background is responding with the masculine equivalent of, "I understand but remain hopeful." What art historians have long described as a charming domestic scene suddenly reveals itself as documentation of a complex romantic negotiation conducted entirely through coded gestures. You move through the gallery with new eyes, discovering that Victorian painters inadvertently created the most comprehensive visual record of fan language in action. The famous portrait, The Duchess at Court, shows Her Grace holding her fan in the precise position that means I have important information to share, while her eyes direct attention toward another courtier whose own fan signals I am listening discreetly. The painter, focused on capturing the grandeur of aristocratic society, unknowingly documented a high-level intelligence exchange between two of Britain's most influential political wives. The photographic evidence proves even more revealing. Early Victorian photographs, with their long exposure times, required subjects to hold poses for extended periods, often freezing fan positions in ways that reveal ongoing conversations. You examine a daguerreotype of the Worthington family from 1878, where young Charlotte's fan position clearly indicates romantic interest in someone outside the camera's frame, while her mother's fan simultaneously signals disapproval and warning. The photograph captures a moment of family tension that the subjects thought would remain private forever. Wedding photographs provide particularly rich documentation of fan language, as these formal occasions required elaborate ceremonial fan communications. You study the wedding portrait of Lord and Lady Ashworth, where the bride's fan positioning suggests she's communicating distress about the arranged marriage to sympathetic female relatives, while the groom's sister uses her own fan to signal reassurance and support. The image, intended to commemorate joyous celebration, actually preserves evidence of family drama, an emotional complexity that the official record ignores. Group portraits of finishing school graduates become treasure troves of fan language evidence when you understand the code. Miss Worthington's Academy class photograph from 1885 shows 16 young ladies arranged in seemingly random poses, but their fan positions create a complex group conversation about their romantic prospects, family situations, and future plans. One girl signals her engagement, another indicates family financial difficulties, and a third communicates her intention to pursue education rather than immediate marriage, all preserved in sepia tones for historical analysis. The most intriguing discoveries come from paintings and photographs that seem to document fan language mistakes and miscommunications. A portrait of Lady Thornfield's garden party shows several ladies whose fan positions suggest they're all responding to differed conversations, creating visible evidence of the kind of communication breakdown that could lead to social disasters. The artist captured the exact moment when fan language was failing, preserving confusion and misunderstanding in brushstrokes and photographic chemistry. Court paintings provide evidence of the most sophisticated fan language applications, where royal gatherings required elaborate protocols that extended to gestural communication. The official portrait of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee reception shows ambassadors' wives positioned throughout the scene, with fans that document international diplomatic conversations. European art historians studying these paintings for political symbolism inadvertently catalogued some of history's most complex examples of coded diplomatic communication. Even casual domestic scenes reveal fan language when properly interpreted. Victorian family portraits often show multiple generations of women, with older ladies' fans positioned to provide guidance and instruction to younger family members. Grandmothers signal advice about marriage prospects. Mothers communicate warnings about family reputation. And daughters respond with everything from gratitude to rebellion, all captured by artists who thought they were simply documenting family affection and domestic harmony. The regional variations in fan language become visible through comparative art analysis. Portraits of American heiresses show fan positioning that would be considered scandalously direct in English society, while French salon paintings document the more subtle, impressionistic fan gestures characteristic of Parisian sophistication. German family portraits reveal the systematic, almost scientific approach to fan communication that reflected broader cultural attitudes toward precision and methodology. Perhaps most poignantly, you discover self-portraits where Victorian ladies documented their own fan language, creating deliberate records of personal communication that they never intended others to decode. These intimate paintings show women positioning their fans to communicate with deceased loved ones, express private emotions, or record significant personal moments through the only language that felt adequate to their experiences. The technical challenges of documenting fan language through visual art become apparent as you study different artistic media. Oil paintings could capture the precise positioning and elaborate decoration of fans, but watercolors better preserved the delicate translucency and movement suggestions that made fan language so ethereal. Photography provided documentary accuracy, but often missed the subtle movement and timing that gave fan signals their meaning. You realize that Victorian art galleries contain one of the world's most comprehensive archives of nonverbal communication, with thousands of paintings and photographs preserving fan language conversations that the subjects never intended to document. These artistic records provide modern researchers with invaluable evidence about a communication system that might otherwise have vanished completely when its last practitioners died, making every Victorian portrait a potential source of decoded conversations from a vanished world. you find yourself in the dusty archives of Cambridge University in 1962, where Dr. Margaret Thornbury, a young social historian with horn-rimmed glasses and an ambitious dissertation topic, hunches over a collection of Victorian letters that would revolutionize understanding of 19th century women's communication. She's about to become the first scholar to seriously attempt decoding fan language, but her academic training in formal linguistics and her complete lack of practical experience with the subtle art of gestural communication will lead to interpretations that are simultaneously groundbreaking and spectacularly wrong. Dr. Thornbury's initial discovery comes through pure accident. While researching Victorian women's correspondence for her thesis on domestic social networks, she notices repeated references to fans that seem oddly specific and contextually important. Mother's instructions regarding the Ashworth fan were quite clear, writes Charlotte Pemberton in 1878, though I confess the reverse palm position continues to challenge my execution. The academic world has completely overlooked these references, dismissing them as trivial fashion commentary rather than evidence of sophisticated communication systems. The breakthrough moment arrives when Dr. Thornbury correlates dozens of seemingly unrelated diary entries and discovers they're describing a systematic language. Her excitement is palpable as she realizes she's uncovered evidence of what she dramatically terms the secret feminine discourse of Victorian England. However, her interpretation methods, based on linguistic analysis rather than practical understanding, immediately lead her astray. She assumes fan language operated like written language, with fixed meanings and grammatical structures, completely missing the fluid, contextual nature that made the system so sophisticated. You witness Dr. Thornbury's first major misinterpretation as she encounters Lady Pemberton's description of the drawing room revelation position. Based on surrounding context about family scandals, she concludes this signal means, "I have discovered family secrets," when it actually meant, "I wish to change the subject." Her systematic approach to cataloging fan positions creates an impressive academic framework, but one built on fundamental misunderstandings of how the language actually functioned in practice. The academic community's reception of Dr. Thornbury's work reveals fascinating biases about Victorian women's capabilities. Male historians initially dismiss her findings as evidence of female frivolity rather than sophisticated communication, while early feminist scholars embrace fan language as proof of women's intellectual resistance to patriarchal oppression. Both interpretations miss the practical reality that fan language was primarily a social navigation tool, rather than either trivial entertainment or political rebellion. You observe the cascade of misinterpretations that follow as other researchers build upon Dr. Thornbury's flawed foundation. Professor James Wickham at Oxford publishes The Semiotics of Victorian Feminine Resistance, arguing that fan language represented organized proto-feminist activism, when most practitioners would have been horrified at such political implications. Meanwhile, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell's competing interpretation presents fan language as evidence of Victorian women's romantic obsessions, reducing complex social communication to simple courtship mechanics. The most spectacular misunderstanding emerges from Dr. Thornbury's attempt to create a Victorian fan language dictionary. Working from fragmentary evidence and lacking any living practitioners to consult, she assigns rigid meanings to fan positions that actually varied enormously based on context, relationship, and regional tradition. Her published dictionary states definitively that fan held against right temple means I am engaged to be married, when disposition could mean anything from I'd have a headache to my father is watching us, depending on dozens of contextual factors. You witness the unintended consequences as Dr. Thornbury's work inspires amateur historical enthusiasts to attempt authentic Victorian fan communication based on her incorrect interpretations. Historical reenactment societies begin incorporating fan language into their events, but their performances bear almost no resemblance to actual Victorian practice. They execute rigid, mechanical gestures based on Dr. Thornbury's dictionary, rather than the fluid, intuitive communication that characterized real fan language. The misunderstandings compound when popular culture discovers academic research on fan language. Historical romance novels begin featuring heroines who communicate through fans with impossible precision and accuracy, while television costume dramas show characters conducting elaborate conversations through gestures that would have been meaningless to actual Victorian practitioners. The fictional versions of fan language become more widely known than any accurate historical understanding. Perhaps most ironically, you discover that some of the most valuable evidence for understanding authentic fan language exists in sources that academic researchers initially overlooked entirely. The letters of Victorian ladies' maids, the diaries of finishing school instructors, and the memoirs of elderly women written in the 1920s contain practical descriptions of how fan language actually worked. But these sources were considered too humble or too distant from the Victorian period to merit serious scholarly attention. You observe Dr. Thornbury's growing awareness of her interpretive errors as she continues her research through the 1960s and 1970s. Letters from elderly women who remember their grandmothers demonstrating fan language reveal that her rigid linguistic model completely missed the improvisational, contextual nature of the communication system. One particularly devastating correspondence comes from Mrs. Adelaide Worthington, age 89, who gently corrects nearly every interpretation in Dr. Thornbury's published dictionary while providing examples of how the same fan position could convey dozens of different meanings depending on the specific social situation. The recognition of these errors leads to what you might call the second wave of fan language research in the 1980s, led by social historians who understand that gestural communication systems operate more like jazz improvisation than written language. Dr. Sarah Pemberton, ironically a descendant of the Victorian family whose letters had initiated the original research, approaches fan language through anthropological methods rather than linguistic analysis, conducting extensive interviews with the few remaining elderly women who had learned fan basics from Victorian-era grandmothers. This new research reveals the staggering complexity that early scholars had missed entirely. Fan language wasn't a simple code with fixed meanings, but a sophisticated social performance that required intuitive understanding of context, relationship dynamics, cultural background, and individual personality. The same gesture could function as question, statement, warning, or invitation, depending on dozens of subtle factors that no dictionary could possibly catalog. You witness the scholarly community's gradual recognition that the Victorian fan language they thought they had decoded was largely a modern academic invention, based on fragmentary evidence and significant misinterpretation. The real communication system had been far more complex, subtle, and contextual than anyone had imagined, making complete reconstruction impossible more than half a century after its last practitioners had died. The most poignant discovery comes when researchers realize that their academic interest in fan language had actually contributed to its historical distortion. By trying to systematize and catalog a communication form that had thrived on fluidity and improvisation, scholars had created a rigid, artificial version that bore little resemblance to the living tradition they were attempting to preserve and understand. You find yourself in the sun-dappled conservatory of Rosewood Manor in 1924, where 87-year-old Lady Constance Pemberton sits in her bath chair, her arthritic fingers still gracefully manipulating an ivory fan that has outlived the world it was designed to navigate. She is quite possibly the last person alive who learned fan language directly from Victorian masters. And as she demonstrates the forgotten signals to her great-granddaughter Emily, a bob-haired flapper more interested in jazz records than gestural communication, you witness the final moments of a dying art form passing into memory. Lady Constance's fan movements retain the fluid elegance that characterized authentic Victorian practice, but they now serve only as historical demonstration rather than living communication. This was how we said perhaps in my mother's day, she explains, executing a subtle wrist rotation that creates a brief flutter near her left shoulder. Emily watches politely, but without real comprehension. her attention clearly divided between her great-grandmother's lesson and the distant sound of a gramophone playing Ain't She Sweet from the drawing room below. The poignancy of the moment intensifies as you realize that Lady Constance is performing these signals for an audience that can no longer respond in kind. Her fan language has become a monologue rather than a conversation, its communicative power neutralized by the absence of other practitioners. She demonstrates the elaborate sequence that once meant, "My mother disapproves, but I remain interested," a signal that required split-second timing and perfect positioning to execute effectively. But the gesture falls into silence, its meaning preserved only in her memory and her explanation. You observe the profound loneliness of being the last speaker of any language as Lady Constance attempts to share more complex communications that require interactive response to demonstrate their full sophistication. The beauty of fan conversation lay in its improvisational quality, she tells Emily. But I cannot show you a proper dialogue when you don't know how to answer. Her fan moves through sequences that would have initiated elaborate exchanges about courtship, family politics, and social intrigue, but each gesture ends in emptiness rather than the responsive communications that had made the system so vibrant. The physical artifacts of fan language begin their own journey toward obsolescence around Lady Constance. Her collection of conversation fans, each designed for specific types of social communication, sits in glass cases like museum exhibits rather than functional tools. The diplomatic fan that had belonged to her mother, decorated with scenes that could reference specific international treaties, has become a curiosity whose hidden meanings are known only to Lady Constance herself. Even the specialized fans created for morning communication or religious observance have lost their practical purpose in a world where direct expression has replaced coded gesture. You witness Lady Constance's attempts to document her knowledge for posterity, dictating descriptions of fan signals to Emily, who dutifully transcribes them into a leather-bound journal. But the written descriptions capture only the mechanical aspects of the gestures, while missing entirely the subtle timing, contextual awareness, and interpersonal sensitivity that had made fan language so effective. Hold the fan at a 30-degree angle to the bodice, while drawing it slowly across the heart, Lady Constance instructs. But the transcription cannot preserve the intuitive understanding of when such a gesture would be appropriate, or how it might be modified based on the recipient's response. The generational disconnect becomes painfully apparent as Emily struggles to comprehend why anyone would choose such indirect communication when direct speech was possible. But great-grandmother, why didn't you simply tell the gentleman that you found him agreeable? She asks, unable to grasp a social world where such directness would have been scandalous rather than refreshingly honest. Lady Constance's attempts to explain the social restrictions that had made fan language necessary sound increasingly archaic to a young woman who drives her own automobile and debates politics at dinner parties. You observe the transformation of fan language from practical skill to family folklore as Lady Constance shares stories rather than instruction. Her great-granddaughter shows much more interest in tales of romantic intrigue and social scandal than in learning the actual techniques that had facilitated such dramas. The fan signals become plot elements in family stories rather than communication methods that Emily might ever use, reducing a sophisticated social art to entertaining anecdotes about the old days. The final blow to fan language's survival comes from Lady Constance's own recognition that the social world requiring such communication has vanished entirely. Even if you mastered every signal I could teach you, dear Emily, where would you use such knowledge? She muses sadly. The ballrooms where fan language flourished have been converted to picture houses, and the drawing rooms where we conducted our subtle conversations now echo with radio broadcasts rather than whispered secrets. Perhaps most movingly, you witness Lady Constance's private moments when she practices fan language alone, conducting one-sided conversations with memories of long-dead friends and family members. Her fan movements retain their precision and grace, but they communicate only with ghosts, creating a spectral dialogue between the living practitioner and the vanished world that had given her skills their meaning. These solitary performances represent the last whispers of a communication system that had once connected thousands of women across continents and social classes. You observe the symbolic moment when Lady Constance closes her fan for the final time in Emily's presence, the ivory ribs collapsing with a soft click that seems to echo with the finality of an entire era ending. "I believe I am the last," she says simply. "And when I am gone, the fans will fall silent forever." The weight of this responsibility, being the final repository of centuries of feminine communication tradition, proves almost unbearable for the elderly lady, who had never intended to serve as the sole guardian of such vast cultural knowledge. The actual end comes not with dramatic finality, but with quiet fading, as Lady Constance's physical frailty makes the precise hand and wrist movements of fan language increasingly difficult to execute. Her arthritis transforms elegant gestures into painful approximations, while her failing eyesight makes the subtle positioning that had defined expert fan communication nearly impossible to achieve. The art dies with its practitioner, not through sudden cessation, but through gradual diminishment of the physical capabilities that had made its performance possible. In your final moments with Lady Constance, you witness her last perfect execution of the fan signal that had meant "until we meet again," a gesture she performs while looking toward a photograph of her long-deceased mother, as if completing a conversation that had been interrupted by decades rather than moments. The fan closes with a whisper of silk against ivory, and with that soft sound, the last echo of Victorian fan language fades into the silence of history, leaving behind only memories, misunderstandings, and the haunting beauty of a communication form that had flourished and vanished like the flutter of wings against the twilight sky.